So it's a great pleasure to welcome you to our afternoon session today, the session on, to make sure I'm reading the right one, Liberty and Truth. And I'm very honored to introduce our speakers. The format's going to be they will both speak and then questions after that. So I'm very honored to introduce our speakers. Father Michael Sherwin, who's an old friend, a very old friend, in fact, a very, very old friend, holds the chair in fundamental moral theology at the University of Fribourg, Switzerland. He is the successor to the wonderful, wonderful Dominican Servais Pinckaers. A native of San Francisco, he received his BA in philosophy from the Dominican School of Philosophy and Theology in 1986, an MA in theology from the Graduate Theological Union in Berkeley, California.
Ladies and gentlemen, your attention, please. Ladies and gentlemen, your attention, please. The next session will be beginning momentarily. Please make your way to the appropriate room.
My clock.
We're finished already?
Yeah. Well, thank you for that very interesting presentation. Despite having received a degree from the Graduate Theological Union in Berkeley, I assure you he is perfectly on board with all the good things about the church. That was 1991. And an MA and PhD in moral theology from the University of Notre Dame. Father Sherwin is the author of By Knowledge and by Love, Charity and Knowledge in the Moral Theology of St. Thomas Aquinas, published by the Catholic University of America Press, and winner of the Cardinal Journet Book Prize presented by the Aquinas Center for Theological Renewal at Ave Maria University. John Waters, I won't say that he's a young friend, because that would make Father Sherwin feel even worse for being an old friend, but he is a new friend of the centers, of Notre Dame's, and I like to think of mine and my wife's. He's a writer and former newspaper columnist, the author of 10 books. Most recently was it for this question, a study of the context of Ireland's undoing in the Tiger years and beyond, although my personal favorite you can get on Amazon is Feckers, 50 people who fecked up Ireland. It's a wonderful book. His forthcoming works include Sleepwalk of Unreason, The Annihilation of the Holy in Modern Ireland, and Crossing the Road, a letter to his father about the state of Ireland 100 years after the Easter Rising of 1916. And I think those topics should indicate what an interesting intellect he has. He's a playwright and songwriter and is currently working on his first novel, and he is a permanent research fellow of the Center for Ethics and Culture. So Father Sherwin, I think, will speak first, and then Mr. Waters, and then we'll have questions afterward.
Well, after all that celebration of Irish culture, I'm going to start with an Englishman. Tiger, tiger, burning bright in the forests of the night, what immortal hand or eye could frame thy fearful symmetry? In the winter of 1932, when Malcolm Muggeridge was in Moscow as a foreign correspondent, he would often walk the streets and observe the Muscovites. He relates that as he walked among them, he had a strange, almost mystical certainty that, quote, as they were, so we were all fated to be. In them, for those with eyes to see, might be discerned the fearful symmetry of things to come, unquote. Muggeridge was captivated by William Blake's notion of fearful symmetry, a fearful symmetry in creation. Throughout his long literary career, as he made his slow, circuitous journey toward faith and the Catholic Church, Muggeridge deepened his understanding of this symmetry. At first, long before he was a believer, as he reported on the events of the world, he began to notice that they seemed to be laced with comic irony. Events that at first glance seemed meaningless and absurd, on closer inspection often seemed perfectly tailored to reveal and comically punish human folly. As he himself would later describe it, the theater of the absurd proves on closer examination to contain within it a theater of fearful symmetry. Muggeridge began to discern that there was order underlying apparent confusion, meaning underlying apparent meaningless. He began, as he would later describe it, to hear, quote, the still small voice of truth that makes itself heard above thunderous falsity, unquote. From personal experience and observation, he came to believe deeply that freedom was dependent, true freedom, was dependent on fidelity to the truth, both to that truth inscribed in nature and the truth who is Christ. Indeed, for Muggeridge, the theater of fearful symmetry is ultimately the stage of God's providential action in creation. It is grace mercifully leading each heart to see itself as it truly is and to find its salvation in Christ. In those desolate years, Muggeridge was not the only one to discover freedom's dependency on truth or its relationship to Christ. In the fall of 1940, while the Nazis' reign of terror was in full force throughout Poland, the young Karol Wojtyła, as a clandestine student, penned in Krakow a play in which he affirmed, one must throw truth across the path of lies. One must throw truth into the eye of a lie. This is so because in truth are freedom and excellence, while the betrayal of truth leads only to slavery. Later, when Wojtyła was pope, he offered his mature Christological reflections on freedom's dependency on truth. Quote, Jesus Christ meets the person of every age, including our own, with the same words, you will know the truth, and the truth will set you free. These words contain both a fundamental requirement and a warning, the requirement of an honest relationship with regard to truth as a condition for authentic freedom, and the warning to avoid every kind of illusory freedom, every freedom that fails to enter into the whole truth about man and the world, unquote. Others in Central and Eastern Europe were making a similar discovery, and often in surprising ways. Muggeridge himself draws our attention to a case that he explicitly describes as revealing God's fearful symmetry, a case of one who discovered true freedom while in prison, the case of Alexander Solzhenitsyn. At the very moment that Wojtyła was reflecting on freedom's relationship to truth, Solzhenitsyn was fighting at the front as a captain in the Red Army. A thoroughly indoctrinated and committed communist, he showed few signs of what he would later become. Towards the end of the war, however, he was thrown into prison for supposedly anti-Stalinist views carelessly expressed in a letter. So began an 8-year odyssey that would lead him through the Soviet system of prisons and prison camps that he would make famous as the Gulag Archipelago. Against all expectation, and contrary to the effect that the camps usually had on an inmate's character, Solzhenitsyn followed the path of a select but happy few, a path that led him to discover truths about himself and the nature of freedom. His transformation began with a renunciation, and I think it's a renunciation that confronts perhaps all of us today, or at least can serve as a challenge. Quote, as soon as you have renounced the aim of, quote, surviving at any price, unquote, and gone where the calm and simple people go, then imprisonment begins to transform your former character in an astonishing way, to transform it in a direction most unexpected to you, unquote. Solzhenitsyn famously adds that, quote, "It was only when I lay there rotting on rotting prison straw that I sensed within myself the first stirrings of good. Gradually it was disclosed to me that the line separating good and evil passes not through states, not between classes, not between political parties either, but right through every human heart and through all human hearts." Solzhenitsyn carried from his prison years, quote, "this existential experience, how a human being becomes evil and how good." The key for Solzhenitsyn was an individual's relationship to truth. Quote, "Anyone who has once proclaimed violence as his method must inexorably choose the lie as his principle. And when a government imposes dictatorial violence, quote, more often than not, it demands of its subject only that they pledge allegiance to lies, that they participate in falsehood." Thus, as Solzhenitsyn explains in his Nobel lecture, quote, "The simple act of an ordinary brave man is not to participate in lies, not to support false actions. His rule, let that come into the world, let it even reign supreme, only not through me." When Solzhenitsyn was finally expelled from the Soviet Union in 1974, he explained this idea more fully. "Violence often demands only of us," this is a quotation, "violence often demands only of us submission to lies, a daily participation in deceit, and this suffices as our fealty. And therein we find, neglected by us, the simplest, the most accessible key to our liberation, a personal non-participation in lies." Solzhenitsyn described this positively as a commitment to live by the truth. For Solzhenitsyn, the first consequence of a commitment to live by the truth is personal repentance. He explains that once we recognize the bitter truth that the dividing line between good and evil passes through the heart of each of us, then the only way forward is, quote, repentance and the search for our own errors and sins. Repentance is the first bit of firm ground underfoot, the only one from which we can go forward, not to fresh hatreds, but to concord. Repentance is the only starting point for spiritual growth, unquote. One person encouraged by Solzhenitsyn's thought was the Czech playwright Václav Havel, who in the fall of 1978 wrote the lengthy political essay, The Power of the Powerless. While Solzhenitsyn understood fidelity to the truth as ultimately fidelity to Christ, becoming himself an Orthodox Christian believer, Havel was an agnostic when he began his political reflections on freedom's relationship to truth. Nevertheless, his understanding of life and the truth articulated the experience of many religious believers, both in Czechoslovakia and in Poland. Havel's essay was an attempt to describe accurately the situation of Czechoslovakia and to suggest a possible future for his country. To do this, he began by articulating the role of lies, of ideology, in the totalitarian regimes as they functioned within the Soviet bloc at that time. Havel portrayed ideology as a false, but apparently high-minded vision of the world that both reinforces the government's dictatorial power and renders it more palatable. The greengrocer who places the political slogans among the vegetables, the office worker who posts similar slogans on the bulletin board. Why do they do it? Havel argues that most do it because it is easier and even more comforting than trying to resist the tide of conformity. Quote, ideology, Havel explains, offers human beings the illusion of an identity, of dignity, of a morality, while making it easier for them to part with all of these. It is a veil behind which human beings can hide their own false existence, their trivialization, and their adoption to the status quo, unquote. Ideology thus provides oppressors and their victims, quote, with the illusion that the system is in harmony with the human order and the order of the universe. Havel further notes that, quote, individuals need not believe all these mystifications, but they must behave as though they did, or they must at least tolerate them in silence, or get along well with those who work with them, unquote. In language reminiscent of Solzhenitsyn, Havel describes this as living within a lie. Quote, they need not accept the lie. It is enough for them to have accepted their life within it and in it. Havel became fascinated by the human capacity to live illusion, to conform one's life to a world of lies. Quote, human beings are compelled to live within a lie, but they can be compelled to do so only because they are in fact capable of living in this way. Each person is capable to a greater or lesser degree of coming to terms with living within the lie. Each person somehow succumbs to a profane trivialization of his inherent humanity and to utilitarianism. In everyone, there is some willingness to merge with the anonymous crowd and to flow comfortably along with it down the river of pseudo-life. It reminds me of faculty meetings at my institution. Havel argues, however, that it need not be the case. He affirms confidently that, quote, the essential aims of life are present naturally in every person. Havel had this confidence because the experience of alienation that comes from living in the lie. Quote, individuals can be alienated from themselves only because there is something in them to alienate. Under the ordered surface of the life of lies, there slumbers the hidden sphere of life in its real aims, of its hidden openness to truth. This fact helped Havel to explain what was happening under the surface of Czechoslovak society in the late 1970s. A growing number of ordinary Czechs and Slovaks were refusing to live the lie, to post the party slogans, to vote in rigged elections, to participate in sham consensus. This refusal was the first step. Next, there were those who had begun a quest to live in the truth about how to make quality beer, or to run an efficient grocery, or other homely truths about the arts and agriculture, literature, or the sciences. Havel explains that once a person attempts to articulate this to others and to organize a meeting with others who are like-minded, to organize a meeting with other grocers, or to teach underground classes on making quality Pilsner lager, and joins with others who wish to do the same, something new is born that Havel describes as, quote, the independent spiritual, social, and political life of society. John Paul II will later describe this as the, quote, subjectivity of society, unquote. Gradually, people begin to develop parallel structures, or even a parallel polis, where the members of society can together pursue the real ends of human life. Havel has in mind here underground universities, underground printing presses, publishing houses, theaters, trade unions, and any other free associations that provide space for the collective pursuit of the authentic aims of human life. Writing in 1978, Havel judged that this was as far as the resistance movements had gotten. He predicted, however, that one possible outcome would be the peaceful collapse of the regime and the emergence of a truly participatory and democratic society. In essence, Havel sketched the features of the Velvet Revolution that would erupt 10 years later. Christians both in Czechoslovakia and in Poland embraced Havel's analysis because it well described their own experience. They too had discovered under the orderly surface of the life of lies that there slumbers the hidden sphere of life in its real aims, of life in the truth. There was this difference, however. Like Muggeridge, they had discerned, quote, the still small voice of truth, and discovered that this truth was not a what, but a who. Moreover, their openness to truth was actually experienced as a response to a truth that sought them out, that had been humbly present to them all along, suffering with them, and revealing to them the Father's love. In short, their encounter with the truth revealed itself as an encounter with the Christ, the Word made flesh, God among them. At this point, it might be helpful to reinsert the title of this conference into its full theological and indeed Christological context. It's an allusion to Galatians 5:1. Quote, for freedom, Christ set us free. So stand firm and do not submit again to the yoke of slavery, unquote. It is Christ who sets us free. He does this by sending his Spirit into our hearts. Quote, where the Spirit of the Lord is, there is freedom, 2 Corinthians. Through the Spirit's action, we are configured to Christ and to begin to live the freedom that comes from living the life of faith, hope, and charity. Quote, for through the Spirit, by faith, we await the hope of righteousness, by faith working through love, Galatians 5:5 and 6. Christians, through the centuries, have experienced that one grows in this freedom by stages. As St. Augustine proclaims, the beginning of freedom is the freedom not to sin mortally. But, Augustine adds, this is only the beginning of freedom, not perfect freedom. Perfect freedom for Augustine is not freedom from, but as Father Pinckaers would say, freedom for. It is the freedom to engage in the morally beautiful actions of the virtues, all of which are ways of loving God and neighbor. However, unlike the pagan conception of virtue, these excellences, these freedoms for excellence, or liberté de qualité, as Father Pinckaers would say, are not something these virtues are not something that comes from us or from our own ethical gymnastics. These excellences are from God, as habitual gifts of grace. Paul states this very clearly when he affirms, quote, I can do all things in him who strengthens me, Philippians 4. And when he tells the Philippians, God is at work in you both to will and to do, Philippians 2. Paul experiences this divine empowerment as a new life made possible in Christ. Quote, for me, life is Christ and death is gain, Philippians 1. The fact that this freedom for excellence is a gift is ever before Paul's eyes because he remains keenly aware of his own poverty. Quote, we hold this treasure in earthen vessels to show that the transcendent power belongs to God and not to us, 2 Corinthians. As it was famously, while asking the Lord 3 times to remove a thorn in the flesh, that Paul received from God the assurance that my grace is sufficient for you, for power is made perfect in weakness, 2 Corinthians. Thomas Aquinas describes this divine affirmation as a marvelous way of speaking, mirus modus loquendi, a phrase he only uses twice in his entire corpus. And he explains, to affirm that virtue is made perfect in weakness is like saying that fire grows in water. This recognition of the contrast between the poverty of what we are on our own and what we can do in Christ is at the heart of Muggeridge's conception of the theater of fearful symmetry. It is what transforms the human tragedy into a divine comedy, a comedy that keeps us joyful, even laughing, in the midst of the sorrows of this life. This is why appeals to nature as the ground of morality, if they are to be Christian appeals, need to be nuanced. For patristic authors, such as Origen and Clement, the book that should guide our study of nature is Ecclesiastes. Vanity of vanities, all things are vanity. For these authors, armed with such a field guide, the study of the natural world both reveals the beauty and goodness of creation and its limited and fleeting character. From our study of nature, of ourselves, and of everything else, we can discern principles concerning how to live, but we also discern our inability on our own to live according to these natural law principles. As such, the study of nature prepares us to receive the merciful instruction of Christ. Now, these reflections can be taken in several different directions, and perhaps at the questions we can address that. But I want to conclude by noting that Václav Havel developed the view that what the peoples of Central and Eastern Europe were suffering in the 1970s was but a concentrated and intensified version of what all peoples in Europe and the United States were confronting. A society, quote, which has renounced the absolute, which ignores the natural world and disdains its imperatives, unquote. For Havel, what they were experiencing in Czechoslovakia was the fusion of, quote, dictatorship and the consumer society, unquote, and therefore offered, quote, an inflated caricature of modern life in general, which could serve as a kind of warning to the West, revealing to it its own latent tendencies. Havel, therefore, shared with Muggeridge the view that the experience of the countries of the Soviet bloc belonged to the fearful symmetry of things to come. From this perspective, we can think about this also during the questions, perhaps. I see this already occurring in places like hospitals and in universities, where we're not required to believe the lies, but we're required to act as if we do. From this perspective, we can join with Havel in asserting that, quote, we must draw our standards from our natural world, heedless of ridicule, and reaffirm its denied validity. We must honor, with the humility of the wise, the limits of that natural world and the mystery which lies beyond them, admitting that there is something in the order of being which evidently exceeds all our competence, unquote. That something is the mystery of God, written in the symmetry of creation. Ultimately, the temptation to live according to the lie is as old as the fall, the first faculty meeting, where our first parents first encountered the father of lies, who was a murderer from the beginning. But in the fearful symmetry of God, the fall was also the occasion of the promise, the proto-evangelion, that promised the woman an offspring who would vanquish the liar and his lies. That offspring who would later be described in the following terms: "The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness cannot overcome it." And thus, we can participate joyfully in the comic theater of God's fearful symmetry, because we know, along with John Paul the Great, that Jesus Christ meets the person of every age, including our own, with the same words: "You will know the truth, and the truth will make you free." Thank you.
Thank you, Father. And now, John Waters, "The Tyranny of the Omnipotent Victim, How Liberty Died While We Sang Songs of Freedom."
Thank you. What I want to do is really to draw a sketch based to a large extent on my own experience of my life so far and the things that happened around it, the things I moved through. It might be hard to believe, but I used to be a cool kind of guy. I used to, when I was a young man, I drove a mail car, which my father had driven for 50 years before me, around the west of Ireland, and used to carry mails and newspapers and lots of things, and also passengers. So it was really kind of a stagecoach with an internal combustion engine, and I drove that. And then as well, I was a rock journalist. So it doesn't, I don't think, in theory, it doesn't get any cooler than that. But and at that moment, I kind of thought I understood everything, because it seemed that we were really kind of embarking on a new world, a new era, a new phase of human history and understanding. Because certainly in Ireland, because everything up to that moment seemed to have been very grey and joyless. That was the version of things we kind of were told and believed. And then it seemed that we were about to create a movement of liberation. And Ireland is a very odd place like that. I wrote a book about this whole experience called Jiving at the Crossroads, which was about my father and our relationship and this moment of collision. And really, I suppose some of the reviews described it as how Ireland jumped the gap between tradition and post-modernity, leaving out the modernity part. And I don't think that's too far off the mark, because that's what we tend to do in Ireland. We start things very late and we finish them before everybody else. You know, it's like doing an exam. You know, you'd have write nothing for the first hour and a half, and then you write it all in the last part. And that's us, you know. And we've had some recent examples of that, which I'm going to come to. So rock and roll was for me really a sense of part of this revolutionary movement, and sense of it defined one's identity, my identity, and the identity of my friends. The music spoke of our lives in some kind of, in a way that nothing else had ever spoken of our lives. And it was very cool, very hip, obviously. And we didn't really pay any attention to actually the source of the music, the origins of the music, even though some of the origins of the music went right back to Ireland. You know, Bob Dylan, in his kind of more honest moments, has admitted to the extent of his plagiarism of Irish traditional music. But parallel to that, and mixed in with that, was, of course, musics which were fundamentally religious. All of the musics which made up the music that we call rock and roll were fundamentally religious music: spirituals, gospel music, country music, which is about, you know, right and wrong, the structure of man, the limits of man in domestic and in intimate situations. And of course the blues, which was really the cry of the human heart for freedom. You know, which started with in the plantations where the slaves were chained together across and would holler to one another across the line, and the hollering would turn into lines, and with the lines would turn into songs, and that was the blues. So here was the music which we inherited. We had only the vaguest idea of this, and to some extent it was kind of, I suppose, just a kind of slightly, you know, exotic factor that the music had these roots, because more important than that was the fact that it was saturated with hipness and with modernity in the cultural sense. So I got into this big time, and it became, I think, a formative influence in my life, and was the result of me. As a result of it, I moved to Dublin, became a full-time journalist, and then moved into the mainstream of journalism. So my experience of life, I've had various key experiences that I've kind of tried to pay attention to somewhat retrospectively, probably a little bit delayed. I'm a slow learner in the spiritual and personal development arenas, and I've talked many times about my experience of alcohol, how alcoholism taught me the limits of my human structure, that it actually this liquid in me showed me how I was made and how I had been abusing my givenness, as it were, by seeking some satisfaction that was for a desire that was really infinite in something that wasn't infinite, that was a toxin, that was a poison. And I also learned about another key experience was my fatherhood, because I became a father to a little girl in a situation outside of marriage 19 and a half years ago. And Roisin is my daughter's name. And Roisin really taught me many things. She was, for the first time, I began to understand a version of freedom that I had never considered before. Because I had always considered that kind of idea of freedom as being related to the rock and roll idea that we had imbibed, which was like basically do what you like. That it was entirely about self-expression, about your sexuality, and about all of those values that had become attached to it. We didn't know from where, really. We didn't really think it through. It seemed obvious that it was part of that countercultural revolution of the 1960s. And I had been living with that for some time. And then these two things happened to me all at once. One was that I began to notice in myself a pattern that I didn't expect in relation to my daughter. With her mother, we had an on-off kind of arrangement. She was with me some of the time, and with her mother, half and half. But there was a weekend situation where I would pick her up on a Friday morning, or after school on Friday, and then leave her back on a Monday or whatever it was. And because there was a long period in between in which I didn't have her, I kind of always felt at the moment when she would arrive or when I would collect her, there was a sense of an impending tension, a kind of a fear, an anxiety that really made it feel a little bit like an imposition. Oh, I've got to do this for a weekend. It's somehow it's making me less free. This parenting, and I would then I found that as the weekend would progress, I would sort of ease in. I would get used to it, and at the end of the weekend, I would not want her to leave. And I started to pay attention to this. That when I look back, it was the experience of actually caring for her that I found the most free thing in my life. Whereas when I would be looking forward to the weekend when I would be free, I would have no idea what to do with it. I wasn't able to find that freedom that I sense ought to be there from the kind of what I realize now is a kind of an ideological idea imbibed from the culture, from the music, from this idea that the satisfaction of my desire for freedom is to be found somehow recreationally, is to be found in all of this external leisure activity. And this is very much, I think, a factor of our culture now, that we look forward to the weekend. If you listen to the radio, they start listening, music radio in particular, they start looking forward to the weekend on Tuesday evening, and they're still talking about the weekend on Tuesday morning. So there's nothing else except weekend, musically speaking. So and so I started to pay attention to this new sense that I had of what freedom was. The other thing I started to find was I started to interrogate, arising from my fatherhood and the things that came out of it. I started to interrogate my politics, because my politics up to that point had been, as you would expect from all that, kind of left-leaning, liberal, but in a very woolly kind of way, a very wishy-washy kind of way, I suppose. Nothing ideological or systematic in any thought process that I'd really gone through, but really ignoring all the inconvenient truths and working my way around them, which is pretty much what most left-wingers in Western societies do, I think, these days. But then when being a single father was a really dramatic thing for me, because I found very soon that my role was not accepted by the society, and that this caused huge difficulties for me personally in trying to maintain the relationship with my daughter, trying to ensure that I had the protections that would be necessary to continue the relationship and to feel that it was not just that I had it, that was able to continue the relationship, but that it was as near as possible a normal relationship, that it wasn't a relationship by concession, that it was a relationship by right, as it were, or by nature, that I could come as close as possible to the idea of the natural relationship between us being understood and protected legally and culturally. And of course, we couldn't have been further from that, and still the same thing is still true for fathers in this situation. So I started to write about this. And the way I kind of summarize it is that having discovered this, the way that the culture and the legal systems kind of bore down upon fathers and their relationships with their children, I kind of thought, oh, naively, this is something that all my friends on the left, all these rock and rollers, are going to be really interested in. They really want to be, they haven't heard about this, they've overlooked it, and as soon as I go and tell them, they're going to come running and they're going to sort it all out. This is going to be a new platform for our, move towards freedom and equality and all those great things that we all stand for. So I went and told them, come quickly, come quickly. And they asked me, well, what exactly is the problem? And I said, well, this is the problem. And they started to kick my head in. And they've been kicking it in ever since. And that made me interested. When people start kicking your head in, even if metaphorically, you start to get interested in why they're doing it, particularly when it seems to be at odds with the things they're saying in public, in the words they're using in public about justice, equality, fairness, all these things. So that became really, that was the moment when I said, so if they're hypocritical about this, what else are they being hypocritical about? So I started to go through everything again. And lo and behold, I found that all the things that I discarded started to make sense, like Catholicism. I began to realize, I began to see gradually, I'm still on that gradual path of understanding, that actually, by and large, the things that Catholicism were saying were a lot more decent, to leave it no higher than that for the moment, than the things that I had believed up to then. And so, really, and that then together with the kind of experience of alcohol, which was when I went to Alcoholics Anonymous and they said, okay, well, what you need to do is get in touch with your creator. And I says, come off it. I'm out of here. No, they said, no, you don't have to use the word God. It's not necessary. You can talk about your higher power. You can talk about God as we understand him. And I went through that, and they thought, fake it till you make it and all that. And I did all this, and then I noticed that my life was actually changing for the better. So I started to pay attention to this idea. So then one day, this guy comes to me and he says, how's it going? I said, it's fine, it's okay, yeah. He says, you pray, yeah. I've told this story quite a bit, so forgive me if you've heard it before. But he said, well, how do you pray? And I said, I just, when I'm brushing my teeth, I say some of those phrases that I remember. And he said, have you tried getting on your knees? And I said, no. I couldn't do that. He said, why not? I said, well, my knees won't bend. My knees just absolutely, they're completely stiff insofar as praying is concerned. And that was true. I mean, in a room on my own with nobody for 100 miles, I wouldn't have been able to get on my knees. And he said, well, okay, we have a solution. Why don't you, in the morning when you're putting on your shoes, take one of your shoes and throw it under the bed. And you'll find you've got to get on your knees to retrieve it. When you're there, say some prayers. So that's what it took. That's what it takes to overcome the kind of, the what would you call it, the way that modernity gets into your DNA and into your muscles and into your. So I did that, and then one day somebody says, "You okay? Oh, everything's okay?" And yeah, the higher power, yeah. How do you feel about calling this God? I said, actually, I don't mind at this stage. It's so what? I've lost so much credibility at this stage. Come on, I might as well go the whole way. So I did, and so that's kind of how I got to be so unfashionable, briefly. But then I started to really pay attention. I started to find out about stuff, about things like the Frankfurt School, which I'm sure the Frankfurt School started in Frankfurt in Germany in the 1920s, and then because of Hitler and all that stuff, it moved to America, to Columbia University in New York, and really it was the project which was being attempted was to prolong the life of Marxism, I suppose. That now that it was becoming clear that the economic project of Marxism was faltering, and that really the proletariat didn't seem all that keen to take up their historical role. They were sort of more interested in meritocracy where it became available and so on, and in drinking where it wasn't, and that Marxism needed a new hero. So this was the search of the Frankfurt School, and many of the intellectuals now, Antonio Gramsci and Marcuse and Eric Fromm and people like that developed this kind of idea of they discovered a new hero for Marxism, and that hero was really essentially the victim of American Western history, of Western patriarchy, whoever that victim might be. And so they identified various women, became a key victim group, gays, blacks, black people, and so on. And the idea was really to use these victims to attack the structures of Western society. Critical theory was the whole ideology, and the theory of the critical theory was simply to criticize everything to do with America, to do with the West, and to do with the values, to do with the patriarchy, so-called, to do with authority, all of these things. And in the 1960s, all of these ideas had somehow found their way into the culture of the 60s, 1968, and from there into rock and roll. That's essentially the broad stroke version of how we got to have the culture we have, that these ideas became acquired center place in our culture, quite invisibly. And it wasn't just that you elevated the idea of the person who had been hard done by, but you denied the right of the oppressor to have any claim on the support of the society or its structures. And that's why, for example, my friends had kicked my head in, because I was actually doing something which I had no idea. I thought we were all talking about justice and fairness and equality, but no, we weren't. We were talking about destroying a particular model of society and replacing it with a new society. And even though they wouldn't have been able to tell me that, they knew to kick my head in. There was something in the unconscious already which told them the right thing to do here is to kick this guy's head in. Because he's saying something that isn't right, cannot be allowed to continue beyond this point. And it hasn't continued beyond this point. So this is where I think if you can master the art of being kicked to death without dying, you start to get into some interesting stuff. And I started to investigate people like Havel, and Father Michael has really given us a beautiful exposition on that. This was a great source to me, of being able to kind of transcend that left-right kind of dichotomy, that dualism that seemed to kind of imprison us, because it seemed ipso facto, certainly in Ireland at the time, that to be in any way modern, compassionate, even Christian, you had to be kind of slightly left-wing, and that you had to then accept all the left-wing analysis of everything, which kind of put you in opposition to lots of different elements of Christianity, but which meant that then you kind of threw your hat at that Christian part of it and just called yourself a socialist. But more and more I became aware of this issue of fatherhood and of the crisis of fatherhood, in the great hidden crisis of Western society in the last 50 years, which is the crisis of fatherhood, which nobody really talks about publicly. That if you go into an American prison, like 90% of the inmates at any given time, particularly the recidivist prisoners, are fatherless boys. If you go into any Western society, you find that suicide figures are 80% young males, particularly young males. And that there's a serious crisis, which Robert Bly has really, I think, done the most to make vivid in his writings, but in particular in this passage, I want to just remember from an introduction he gave to a book by Alexander Mitscherlich, a German psychoanalyst, called Society Without the Father. Robert Bly described how the father had died, the great father had died in Western society because of the Industrial Revolution. And he said it wasn't a premeditated crime, but that it happened collaterally as a result of their Industrial Revolution, whereby the father was forced out of the home. Up to that, Bly said, he had been working with objects in clear view of his children, fumbling incompetently with nuts and bolts and saws for his children to see, pausing to show his child how to hold a nail or a calf. So you can see what has been lost in this. And when I read this, I understood not what I had lost, but what I had gained from my own father. This was precisely what my father had done. In the circumstances we were in, that this was something. And I became determined that my child could not lose this. Whatever capacity I had to transmit this onwards, I had to overcome this corruption of the culture that was saying to me, get out of here. You don't belong here. Your presence isn't unnecessary. You're an obstruction to progress. You're a, superfluous, vexatious male. So that became the big fight. And that's the fight that has got me into so much trouble since. It's interesting, and I've just come out of a big debate in Ireland on, well, I would call it gay marriage. Some people call it same-sex marriage. Some people, but in Ireland we call it marriage equality, which, as you can understand, it's a phrase which is designed precisely so that you don't, it's impossible to turn it down. It's impossible to refuse. Who can be opposed to equality? Who's opposed to marriage? The two together surely got to be good. Something like that. That is more or less the argument that won the referendum by a landslide or whatever it was. So those of us people on this, I was among them on the other side. And in that course of the last 2 years, it's interesting. I found myself in conflict with the most extraordinary people. For example, Madonna. Madonna became interested in Irish affairs for a brief period back about a year and a half ago when I became involved in a controversy. I'm sure Madonna's never heard of me, really. Probably by now has forgotten me again. But she became very interested and had some very stern things to say about people like me. And this again, this is, so, when you think of the kind of tradition of rock and roll, which I would trace from the blues to somebody like, say, Johnny Cash, that to me is the kind of the true line of rock and roll, of the blues, of those musics, the roots music into the modern era. Johnny Cash, I'd say, was one of the great educators of my daughter because he was the only artist on whom we could agree for years. So we actually, in the car going around, is the only body we could play that both of us would tolerate. And so we went through everything he ever sang, song by song, and played each one at least 100 times and talked every song to death. And, this is what this culture means to me. I'm deeply infatuated with it still, but what I'm here to say is that it's actually been appropriated for very sinister ends in our culture. And, there are other examples, like Bob Dylan is a very interesting one because I think he's the artist of the greatest integrity and still is somebody who is, but he's, true to that original impulse to explore the nature of man and the world in this form. There's a song he did on the album before last, the one about the Titanic, Tempest. But the song I mean was The Long and Wasted Years, which is really the most beautiful song about a relationship which has gone on and on and on, but there is no love there. But somehow the absence of the love creates a new kind of love, and he gets this in the most amazing way across, So, but that song, I think that the song of the revolution that we were all supposedly part of from 68 onwards is really the times they are changing. And in his book Chronicles, his memoir, it's a beautiful book, he talked about this and about how it had been really misunderstood. He didn't quite say how it had been misunderstood, but he did say it had been misunderstood. He tends to do things like that and lay new false trails over the old false trails he has set down. He also said that his favourite politician was Barry Goldwater, and those of you who know who Barry Goldwater is will scratch your heads about that a little bit, but there you are. But then you have things like, the way that, a band like U2 found it necessary to intervene in the gay marriage debate on the side of, in Ireland, on the yes side. Why? In what sense is it necessary? So there's a huge cultural capital to be gained. And I want to explore that because This is how, the Frankfurt School's agenda is being prosecuted now. This is the cutting edge of this agenda, which is being prosecuted in our cultures through propaganda, through bullying, through lies, through celebrity pressure, through demonization of those who dare to speak out against it, and really through the annihilation of reason in public affairs. Because what we have is a kind of a carrier signal of emotion in our cultures, into which propaganda is pumped by our media, and in which, because our heads are so full of noise on a 24/7 basis, because of all the nonsense that we're being pummeled with, we only have time to clutch on to cliches like marriage equality. And anybody who tries to make a reasonable argument based in constitutional facts or natural law or any of that stuff sounds like a complete idiot, a crank. And not alone are they actually wrong by definition, but they actually are exacerbating the wrong, historical wrong done to the victim. And this is where I come from my phrase, the omnipotent victim. Because in a situation like this, the person who was the victim becomes all-powerful. And the person who was supposedly all-powerful becomes helpless, powerless. And this is what's happened in our cultures. It's what's happened in Ireland, and it's how the war was won. Not through facts, not through reason, but simply by slogans, by moral blackmail, by emotional blackmail, and by then in modern tools of propaganda, Twitter, etc., which have created an amplifier for these simplistic slogans and for the power, and also an amplifier of accusation against those who dare to dissent. So if you can imagine trying to make a reasonable argument against people who are screaming, who are accusing you of hate crimes, while themselves hating you more than anything you've ever seen. That's kind of where it is. So I think of our civilization, therefore, as really at a critical moment, because we have been completely enfeebled intellectually, culturally, by these processes. And we see this nowhere more clearly than in the context where we find ourselves now in relation to ISIS. Because here we have really a kind of a pincer movement of two totalitarianisms. The totalitarianism that I've spoken of that soft cultural Marxism, which infects everything in our societies, and then, in a certain sense, the totalitarianism of the antithesis, which has complete contempt for this, but nevertheless sees the opportunity that it offers, the enfeeblement it generates in a society, and is able to take advantage of that. And this pincer movement is actually leading us down to the reversal of history. It is putting history into reverse. It already has happened, in my view. I have a sense, sometime around 2008, that history reached the end of its trajectory and started to turn around. And they were now moving backwards through the force of these, through the pressure of these forces, and that we are moving back towards, at an extraordinary rate. Because if you consider the fact, I talk about the omnipotent victim, in our ideological context in Ireland, in the world, the Islamist is a victim. And the Islamist is entitled to call upon the protection of our culture. And that protection is always forthcoming. And whether that protection is expressed in the idea of David Cameron talking about introducing laws against Islamophobia while World War III is cranking up around him, or whether it's simply somebody who's doing a frisk at an airport who thinks it doesn't really reflect well on his credibility if he's over thorough with a particular kind of person. The opposition to profiling, for example, in our societies. These things are putting us in harm's way, and they're putting our children in harm's way. And there is this, therefore, this relationship where all of the cultural forces that we have summoned up in the past 50 years are now coming to fruition. So just to finish, I'd say I really would recommend to you a number of books, but two to finish, by Michel Houellebecq, his book Submission, which is really a prophecy of the very immediate future, 5 years hence, when France, according to the story, becomes an Islamic society, has an Islamic government. Now, it may be a fantasy, in a certain sense, but in the story, the way he tells it, there are many, many truths for us. And it's a continuation of a book which he wrote 15 years ago called Atomized, which details the disintegration of the culture we have under the pressure of the kind of things that I was talking about earlier. That culture, soft cultural Marxism, the obsession with sexuality as the route to satisfaction of the human desire in every way, and so on. These are the artists, I think, there are very few signs of hope. I was in Dublin Airport yesterday, and just to finish, and I was on the queue waiting for security, and a musician whom I know very well came up to me, came past, and he had I won't say his name and I won't say his instrument because that would give it away, but this guy, we soldiered together many times back in the mid-90s when we were commemorating the Irish famines of the 1840s. We used to go on the road and he would play and I would do my readings which were basically about the genocidal tendencies of our near neighbours. And he would play his instrument and we were very close friends. But the other day, he simply nodded curtly to me and kept walking. This is how the culture works. The forbidding, when you breach the protocols, you become superfluous to approval and to requirements. And that's unfortunately what everybody is now afraid of. And that is what's going to kill us. Thank you very much.
When I hear that whistle blowing, I hang my head and cry. I wish my kids had been here for that talk so that they'd understand why I insist that they listen to that song over and over and over again. Well, thank you, John and Father Michael. And now we have actually a good deal of time for questions. I'll field the question and then hopefully you will speak loudly from the table so that we don't have to keep getting up and down. You can, do the two of you want to just come up and then field the questions on your own? That's probably the easier. John, do you want to?
It's easier for the camera, it's easier for everyone to hear.
Or I could point to people and then you just say what.
But if one of us doesn't get any questions, it's going to be very embarrassing.
Yes. Well, it's my duty then to ask a question, so that doesn't happen. So, question. Please stand and identify yourself and project your voice.
I'm Gina Hitz. I'm from St. John's College. This question is for Father Sherwin. I wanted to ask a question about this distinction of think there's between freedom from and freedom for. Because I wonder if another way of thinking about freedom for, something about freedom for and noise, I feel like doesn't really, you're trying to capture the positive aspect of it, but it doesn't really sound like analogous to freedom in another sense. That's the intuitive whole. So I'm wondering whether freedom, that kind of freedom is also freedom from the appetites, freedom from the rat race, freedom from the power struggles, so freedom from the world and the flesh and the devil. And if that isn't a way that might connect more intuitively to the kinds of notions of freedom we have in the modern culture, I don't know.
Yeah, well, I mean, thinkers, there's two different elements, right? There's this distinction between freedom of indifference and then freedom for excellence.
Right.
But then there's the other thing that he's very much aware of the first stage of the moral life is living the minimum requirements of the moral life. So that freedom from. But I think we don't have enough daily experience with the type of freedom he's talking about, with freedom, liberté de qualité, and the analogies really come from the arts that I think are the most helpful. And he uses the analogy of learning to play the piano. And you can bring this out. I mean, I had the unique privilege in life of knowing, I haven't known all of the great rockers, but I have known some real jazz musicians. And the fantasy is that in jazz improvisation is just doing whatever the hell you want. And it's not. It requires that you have internalized the structure of music, especially Western music, and internalized a whole tradition of jazz standards in order so you can have four musicians creating music together that actually sounds good and brings joy to them and to everyone there. In order to get to the point where you can do improvisations like Vince Guaraldi does in the music he wrote for the Charlie Brown Christmas, that incredible improvisation that is very difficult for anyone to recreate today as real improvisation, is the result of a whole series of learning that is a freedom for. I can go up to a piano and I have the freedom to make noise, but I don't have the freedom to create something beautiful on that piano. That freedom is acquired over time, over long periods of time. So there's the experience of the human development of these excellences, but there's also that unique thing that nature, living the virtues, living the type of things that Professor McIntyre was talking about yesterday. On the human level, we have these experiences, but then the encounter with the gift of grace, growing in something that goes beyond what we could do on our own, is also analogous. A freedom for a type of quality action. It is a freedom for something that we couldn't do without that training, but also without that relationship with Christ. So that's what we mean for. It's a different notion, and people have fewer and fewer occasions to develop analogous forms of that qualitative existence. And I think it's not by accident, therefore, that people have more and more difficulty to understand what real freedom is.
Maybe, actually, I was wondering, John, as I listened to you against the background of Father Sherwin's talk, do you find that, in terms of what you were sort of setting out there as this experience of the last, say, 40 years, do you find that distinction helpful for thinking about that? The two kinds of freedom, the contrast?
Certainly, yeah. In fact, that's what I was kind of getting at in my own way in relation to my daughter, and that moment of realizing that my freedom actually was bound up with doing things for her. And it's a different version of the same thing. But I think that in our culture, certainly that the idea of freedom is what you want to do what you want, which is really the sex, drugs and rock and roll version of reality now. And it's kind of writ large in our culture in that sense. And on the internet, that is the value that you run into if you actually happen to find yourself lost and stumbling onto that terrible terrain. That's what you encounter, is this idea that any imposition on the desire of any one person to do certain things is actually almost by definition a theocratic intervention in that person's life, and therefore wrong. So I certainly recognise that that's a motif in our culture, which I think has probably roots back to the Enlightenment. Obviously, it's very hard somehow to see this tracked into our culture. How these values, how does Descartes get into the mouths of people who have never really got beyond, who did a degree in commerce, for example, in the University of Dublin or whatever. But it does seem to happen. It does seem to happen that the value system that were born then seem to be writ large now in our culture and are impossible to challenge. And they're related to this carrier, of emotion, this like a radio band, a radio wave that carries the kind of communications which we all receive, onto which are uploaded, as it were, every day, these kind of emotive messages about other people's needs and other people's desires, which are precisely to pound the piano, if they so please. No matter, and if you object, then there's something wrong with your ears, or there's something wrong with your tolerance. And I think that's, a core part of this culture. And nothing could be further, I believe, from the sensibility of the original roots musics, spiritual music, gospel music, all of these musics which are sensibility of those was profoundly different. But we have now a very aggressive culture and a very isolated culture, a very atomized culture, and a very, I heard a speaker this morning talk about the word loneliness, you know, that each person seeking some kind of affirmation in the group, in, you know, among other atoms, really. But feeling they have to share the same value system, feeling that they can only exhibit these values, that if they exhibit other values, that they will be rejected. And by and large, that's the thrust of our culture now.
Well, we try to move. Well, go ahead.
Michael Doherty, the lead. Mr. Waters, you talk about the omnipotent victim and the emerges from kind of a shallowness or emptiness. But I wonder if Ireland and the Western world was prepared for this omnipotent victim, in part because of Christianity, where the omnipotent God makes himself a victim. It's an act of self. In ways, what you're describing is the reversal of a victim making themselves omnipotent and trying to create a new social order out of their victim by exercising power. And I wonder, in a sense, if it's a sign of decay of the substance of Christianity, but that these things still linger on as it kind of goes.
I do think that's right in a way, that there have been these corruptions, and they have slipped into our culture, even though our culture becomes increasingly atheistic. And believe it or not, I mean, people outside Ireland seem to find it hard to believe, because people still talk about Ireland being the most Catholic nation in Europe. Well, I find this, I would tell you now that it's the most anti-Catholic nation in Europe, because of it having been intensely Catholic, it has this now intense desire to purge itself of Catholicism. And therefore, you know, whereas other countries like, say, England, they're relatively indifferent to the question of Catholicism, Ireland is vehemently and vociferously against it. So, yes, that these kind of, you see these kind of corruptions not alone in that context, Michael, but also in relation to, say, you know, a kind of a blurring of a conflation of socialism and Christianity, for example, and even like avowed atheists citing Christian teaching or Jesus as a reason for doing what they say, in other words, you know, and so on. So you have many said. The Easter Rising, of course, of 1916 was itself inspired by the occasion of Easter, and had that meaning in the minds of the revolutionaries. And of course, that left a very strong imprint, you know, even if people don't necessarily approve of it now, and many people don't, because for other reasons it has become revised and rejected. Nevertheless, the idea of making a martyr of yourself and making everybody feel sorry for you, that was very strong in Irish culture even before that, because of what we used to call the Brehon laws. I mean, one of the core ways of operating, if you were wronged under the Brehon laws, was to go to the doorstep of the person who had wronged you and starve yourself. So that kind of idea of victimhood is, of course, very strong in Irish culture. And somebody coined anachronism for. I don't agree with some of this stuff, by the way. I'm just telling you what people. But there's an anachronism which is quite funny. Mope. About the Irish, M-O-P-E, most oppressed people ever, and there is a bit of that in Irish culture, you know. But it has become, and I find this is really where it gets scary. Really, is that actually I find in myself, and I see in others, that when you are wronged by this culture of the omnipotent victim, your first instinct is to go into an alternative form of victimhood, to start crying about what they're doing to you. And I do this myself, until I, as it were, check myself. That's a phrase we use in Ireland now because of the division. You've got to check your privilege and all that. I check my own victimhood and try to purge it as fast as I can. But yeah, I mean, I think that because Christianity is no longer understood, certainly it isn't understood in Ireland. I don't think it ever was understood in Ireland, believe it again. But it's now being used by all kinds of people in terms of its kind of mythological value. To make their own points.
Yeah, I'll respond to that. I think especially in the context of preparing for the Year of Mercy, it's important, I think, to remember that our unseen enemy, again, the father of lies, just look at titles like Lucifer. Lucifer is actually a Christological title. It's the morning star. And that's applied to Christ. So it shouldn't surprise us that the act that saves us from sin and death is aped by our unseen enemy. And the Year of Mercy is basically drawing on the theology of the epistle of Paul to the Ephesians. And Ephesians, it makes very clear, our enemies are not our contemporaries. Our enemies are not flesh and blood, which allows us to see our contemporaries with great compassion. If we are really Christians, we should be ready to die for them. Our enemies are our unseen enemies who hate our guts, and they are at work. So all notions of conspiracy theories usually are wrong at the level of causality. Humans aren't smart enough to pull off a real conspiracy theory. It's got to be transcendent, and therefore our response has to be transcendent. But the way we find joy in life is to realize we are going to be configured to Christ. That means we're going to be crucified. But the result is going to be to participate in the salvation of the world. So I always thought I was a Celtic optimist. That is, we expect things to be much worse than they are, and we can be joyful when we discover that they're not. So,
or vindicated when they are.
Yeah. So anyway, I don't think it should surprise us that, and I think this was in terms of Muggeridge, who I quoted, this is part of the fearful symmetry. The contemporary culture in many ways apes Christ. And then comes away looking really silly in the end. I mean, you can look at the ceremonies with regard to the image of Stalin and Lenin. It's all drawn on Eastern Orthodox notions of iconography. But it's silly. It's silly. Where are Stalin's legions now? How many legions does Stalin have? Sooner or later, you're made to look like a fool if you try to replace Christ. And therefore, we can be joyful, because in Christ is the final victory.
It's now 2:48, and I don't know, will they come over, or can we take another question? Will they, over the?
Oh, I have no idea.
Why don't we take one last question over, either one of you?
Sure? Okay, I appreciate it. Fred Patricio, I'm studying at the University of Wisconsin, a place where the Frankfurt School dream is still very much alive. I have a pragmatic question for John, and also I want to hear Father's insights. It's very true that once you breach the protocol, your voice is gone. So I'm wondering, how do I, or all of us, exercise prudence? Is there a prudence to being silent up to a point, or getting into a culture, having some authority perhaps as a journalist, etc., and then
Yes.
breaking protocol?
The point is well tenure.
Okay, well, that's, I guess and for Father maybe, well,
I'll just quickly jump in. I mean,
yeah.
if the hovels of the world teach us anything, is that we need to not take seriously the reigning culture. But we shouldn't wait for our leaders to liberate us. Most of what was going on within Czech and Slovak society was under the radar for most of its life. And that's true for the workers, what they were doing in Poland. Havel always rejected the West's attempt to look at what was going on there simply by what the dissidents were doing. He always used the word in quotation marks because he felt they were just the tip of the iceberg and that they could exist because there was a huge underground culture that was choosing to live a different way. And I think there is a huge underground culture in the United States. It's choosing to live a different way. It is never on the media. It's never in the news. And it is changing our society. So I think that's the level at which you live. You start at parallel structures. The fact that families confronted with a situation where their children cannot be educated, are raising their children at home, and then networking with other families, they are doing exactly what Havel describes. If you go to Grand Rapids, you have Catholics and Protestants working together to pursue the real aims of life together. And it's not in the newspaper, even in Grand Rapids, but especially not on the national media. But they are the people who are going to be educating the future and leading the future. So the way you get over it is by deciding to create a parallel culture. Alistair McIntyre at his 80th birthday party said at his talk, at his conference, he said, don't go into philosophy unless you have to, unless it's a necessity to pursue these questions. But if you go into philosophy, do it on the margins and don't do academic philosophy. And what he meant by this, in his nice, exaggerated way, was just that, to pursue it in ways where you don't configure yourself to the criteria of the larger culture, but you find deeper values and promote them in non-mainstream ways. I think that's the answer.
Yeah, I actually used to give a different answer to this question before, because when I was asked about prudence, I would kind of argue in favor of prudence, you know. And I used to quote, you may have heard of Father Giussani, and this is his line where somebody was getting a job in university, and they asked him, well, what should I do? Should I talk about my Christianity, or what should I do? And he says, kiss ass until you get tenure, and then do what you like. and that was kind of my policy. And whenever a young journalist would ask me how would they deal with their faith or their outlook on reality in a liberal so-called newspaper, I would more or less say the same thing. You know, make yourself indispensable and then corrupt your function. That was kind of, but now I have a different answer based on the last couple of years' experience, because there's actually a third way, if I can take that. There's between, you know, pragmatism, you know, prudence, and reckless blundering in for the sake of, I am a Catholic, therefore I have to do this. I actually find the middle way, I describe it as cowardice, which is combined with recklessness. At some point your cowardice hits your recklessness and you're out there again. And that's kind of what happened to me. I absolutely swore for about a year and a half of the last year that I wasn't going to get involved in any more of this stuff. I wasn't going to have anything to do. They could all fight their own battles, and but I always had this sense of that story about Peter, you know, St. Peter and Jesus, you know, the kind of resonance that has for us in the modern world, you know, where aren't you one of them? Aren't you with him? And he says, no, not me. And then the cock crew, and there you are. And then so you get very alert for cocks crowing, and so you kind of, and so I found myself kind of, I suppose, in a very kind of unheroic way, stumbling back onto the battlefield against my will, but still there. And I think that's kind of what I would recommend now, is kind of tune in and you'll be pushed on. You know what I mean? If you just make yourself available or not make yourself unavailable, you'll get pushed onto the battlefield. And that's kind of what I mean by cowardice. You know, it's you're just sort of waiting for somebody to make the decision for you, and they always do.
Well, please join me in thanking our speakers.